coming out. I really appreciate it. I really honestly didn't expect such a large crowd. So I'm going to do my best not to trip over what I'm saying, and I'm going to do my very best not to bore you. Much of the night's talk was inspired by a film called Inception. And this was a film that was created, that is, that it was written and directed by a gentleman named Christopher Nolan. Mr. Nolan has a very intuitive grasp of the human mind. And in this film, we track the activities of a band of agents who specialize in corporate espionage. Now, they don't break into banks, and they don't break into high security areas. What they do is that they steal information by breaking into somebody's unconscious. They do so with a technology that puts the target to sleep in such a way that they can share an entire dream world. Now, Cobb and his band of agents, they're really good at what they do, and they have to be. Because when you enter the deeper layers of a shared dreamscape, you begin to lose yourself. You start not being able to differentiate between the dream and reality. And if you go to the deepest layer in limbo, like Saito here did, something else happens. You lose your identity. And what really underpins this loss of self is the fact that limbo, the deepest layer of the dreamscape, is functioning along a time frame that the characters' minds can't track, such that 5 minutes in reality feels like a year. So I hope throughout the course of our talk and our time together tonight, no pun intended there, that we can get a sense for why Saito's in this state in limbo within the dreamscape. And before I go too much further, I wanted to kind of draw your attention to the difference in dimensionality between what I would call psychological timing and things that you've already been exposed to in this series, such as cosmological or geologic time. Now, you've heard from very talented scientists like Pierre Maistre and Thomas Fleming that the universe started in a singularity that was of near infinite density and temperature. And somehow the singularity exploded and started expanding to give rise to galaxies, stars, and solar systems, and eventually our own planet. And when you hear that story, it's almost fantastical. We're in awe of it. Why are we in awe of it? Because we can't personally relate to it. Can we personally relate to the fact that the Big Bang happened over 13.8 billion years ago? Let's do a small test. Let's go over the geologic timescale that was discussed by Dr. Jessica Kapp. The era that we're in is separated from the dinosaurs by 65 million years. Now that gap is about 10% of the gap between current time and when the Big Bang occurred. Do we get a tangible sense that that time frame is any closer than when the universe started expanding? Probably not, even though it's just 5%. So what happens in psychological timing, the way that we relate to time is a personal relationship. We have a personal relationship with it. And it's that personal relationship that is going to determine how we make sense of things. Now, our first intuition about time is perhaps with a visual reflex. That is, how quickly can we perceive that something has happened in our environment? Now, you could test this in the laboratory, and we do with visual tasks. We do it with an assortment of them. The simplest one goes by the moniker of a simple reflex test. And what happens is that you seat somebody in front of a computer screen, and then you have them respond to the same stimulus with the same response, such that if you sit them in front of a computer screen and show them the letter A, they have to hit a space bar. And when you test people in this kind of paradigm, what you find is that you can see a reaction time of about 200 milliseconds. Now, that 200 milliseconds is a bit of a head fake, because in reality, we're probably not responding that fast to things in our environment. And an overview of other kind of reflex tests that we do would give you the reason why. So another thing that you could do is you can ask somebody to conduct a recognition reflex test. So now, instead of having to respond to the same stimulus over and over again, there's a memory set of a bunch of letters, for instance, that they might have to respond to, and a distractor set of numbers that they're not supposed to. And when you find this, there's a big jump in people's reaction time. It doubles. So now they can only respond with a gap of about 400 milliseconds. You can even complicate things further and make them do what we call a choice reaction test. And there, not only do people have to respond to the letters, but they have to respond to the letters by pushing the corresponding key on a keyboard. At that point, your reflex time goes linear with the number of items that you have to keep in your short-term memory. And it's linear by about 40 milliseconds per item. Now, what you should deduce from all of this is that if you want to live in the sub-second world, it takes practice. And it takes practice whether you're trying to steal second, or whether you're trying to catch a football pass, or you're trying to dogfight in a jet. It takes practice. And living in a sub-second world could mean, well, here, life or death. The interesting thing about reaction times is that it depends on what sensory system you're looking at. So with our vision, we have a response gap of about 200 milliseconds. With our auditory system, it's actually shorter. We can deduce that we've heard a sound in about 150 milliseconds. There's two interesting things here with regards to our consciousness when things have happened in the environment. Our sensory systems are working at different time scales, aren't they? And yet, right now, or if you're going to go to a carnival, or if you're going to go to an event with a rich sensory environment, you'd find that you're registering everything as if there is a present. It's a cohesive present that you're experiencing. And what our brain does is to align the timing of all that sensory information so that you do get that cohesive experience. The other thing that's worth mentioning about our consciousness of things happening in our environment is, think about it. There's a 200 millisecond gap with our vision. There's a 150 millisecond gap with our hearing. We're living in the past. We're never living in the present. It's a weird kind of thing, but it's actually true. So in terms of how a psychologist would understand time, one way we do is through the study of reflexes. The other is by something called interval timing. So we actually have neurons in our brain whose oscillations represent short time intervals. We have neurons that will represent time intervals from seconds to minutes. So this is extremely adaptive, because obviously to wait for the train or for the bus doesn't require a timepiece. It doesn't require us looking at the position of the sun in the sky and determining whether it's moved a degree or not. We have an intuitive grasp of it. And perhaps a better example of our interval timing is exhibited in music. So if you're bowing a violin, or if you're hitting the keys on piano, you have to have tempo. You have to have an intuitive sense for the timing in which you do those things. And if you're Yvonne Fisher here, with the Budapest Festival Orchestra, your job's even harder because you're not having to track one instrument. You're having to track every instrument in the string and brass section, and you're having to update this information as the music, as the score moves from one second to the next. So what does our interval timing allow us to do? It allows us to anticipate and to have a rhythm with which we even talk to each other. So if you notice, there's a natural porosity to the way that we communicate with one another. And that porosity requires, in part, interval timing. The thing about our interval timing is that there's a cost to it. It requires immense attentional resources, and those attentional resources are compromised when we're under severe stress, such as a group of Syrian refugees that are being deported from European countries. I just use it as an example because that's where the context of the picture. Why does our interval timing, why is it led astray under stress? Well, first it's because there's a huge amount of attentional resources that's devoted to it. But there's another interesting thing that happens under stress. Our mind starts working very fast. And what we do is that we start crystallizing every aspect of our visual field. It's fueled by stress hormones, okay? So you're forming memories of the situation like a high-speed camera. And you're normally not forming memories that fast. And when you start forming memories that fast under duress, it feels like more time has passed than what really has. It's why under stress, we feel like 30 seconds is an eternity. Now, what happens under emotional duress gives us a window into how time perception changes while we're aging. So, if you look at a child, if you remember back to your own childhood, those summers, they lasted a really long time. They don't so much anymore. And I'm learning that, years now are flashing by. So the reason why is because at that point, we don't have much experience with the world. The world has a tremendous amount of fascination. There's so much to encode. There's so much to remember. And because of how much mental space we're devoting to all of that, it feels like time is stretched out. Not so much as we get older and we're wise and we grow to have experience. One of the penalties we pay for growing wise is that the world does lose a bit of fascination and we take for granted the passage of time so that we underestimate the duration. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't mention one other aspect where time seems to slow down. There's two areas that psychologists have documented time perception slowing down. One is under duress, when you're exhibiting a fight or flight response and you're running away from the tiger in the jungle. The other is when we think we've met our mate and we fall in love. And there's a reason why, with your husband or wife, you can remember the first date. You can remember being picked up in the taxi. You can remember perhaps a glass of wine falling from a table and seeing the wine shot up into the air in this amorphous shape before it hits the ground. And the reason why is that in that state, your mind is also racing and you're forming a lot of memories. So that's an interesting natural bookend, I think, to time perception as it pertains to emotional states. It is very interesting how running away from a lion can be almost synonymous with walking towards the aisle. But I'll leave you with that thought. Now, in terms of interval timing, it's really adaptive to be able to accurately estimate short time intervals. It's adaptive to strategically break our perception of time when needed. It's not adaptive to have it completely dysfunctional. And one of the unfortunate things about where we process time intervals in our brain is that they overlap with brain areas that are affected in conditions like ADHD. So if you have a child with ADHD, they can't really differentiate the duration of the world around them too well. So if you ask them to differentiate for how long the light is on in the laboratory and ask them, was it 15 seconds or was it this other one 25 seconds, they have a really tough time doing that relative to typically developing kids. And for them, depending on the research that you probe, for them, they're in this constant state. It's not something that where their time interval perception is suspended. They're in a constant state where 5 seconds feels like a minute, feels like 2 minutes, feels like larger time. So you can imagine with a child with ADHD, relating to the world is really complicated. And we're only beginning to understand how we might be able to influence their time perception so that we may be able to address some of their needs beyond what drugs might be able to provide. Another way that we differentiate time is through a relative sense for when events occur. Now that's a picture of the hippocampus. It's this beautiful seahorse structure that's folded into the side of your brain. And it's usually studied from the standpoint of spatial navigation. We have one of the most preeminent psychologists in the world named Lynn Nadell at the University of Arizona. And much of his early work was devoted to convincing the world that this part of the brain was important for giving us a sense of space. Turns out it also gives us a sense of time. And it's not random why I chose to show this image to illustrate what the hippocampus does, because what it can do is to differentiate and record sensory information that's just off by a few milliseconds in hindsight. So we have a very powerful mnemonic device that can separate out events. We call that pattern separation. Now, the problem with trying to estimate time through a relative sense is that we don't remember the middle too well in a series of things. We remember the beginning pretty well. We remember the end, what came most recently. We don't remember too much of the middle. So trying to use our serial order memory, quote unquote, to gauge time doesn't have much resolution over a lifetime. And to convince yourself of this, you probably could remember the first 3 books you ever read. You might even be able to remember the order in which you did. But if you try to do this through thinking through the lens of your entire lifetime, that perception probably breaks down. And what's interesting is that despite that, in a way that we don't really understand, we're still able, after many, many years, to still get a sense for when events occurred. So if you went to Disney World, let's say 20 or 30 years ago, let's say you spent a week with the kids, you know, the kids get 5 days at Disney World, you get your 2 days at Epcot, you could probably differentiate events that happened in Disney World versus Epcot. Now, over time, you may see a conflating of events, but still, you have a pretty good separation of things. So if our serial order memory has such low resolution, how are we able to really do this? Well, it's because something happens as we age with our perception of when events occurred. It's a lot less verbatim. We stop becoming interested, for instance, in whether event C happened before D. And what we do is that we start boxing them in larger and larger boxes, so that when we're younger, we place events that happened in boxes of 2 weeks, for instance. So we'll remember everything and pair everything that happened in 2 weeks perceptually in a particular box. But as we age, those boxes become bigger, so that perhaps we'll separate out events that happen in the same month. Eventually, we'll separate events based on what year they occurred. And you can now get a sense for why in popular culture, people say things like, well, the 80s were a blur. Because by that point, they're probably clustering events along the time frame of a decade. So, time orders our thinking. What do I mean by that? Well, here's a poem by T.S. Eliot, and it's the first couple of lines from his work, Burnt Norton. And he says, time present and time past are both perhaps present in time future, and time future contained in time past. Now, I'm not a poet, and Eliot probably had layers of meaning in this language. What I take from it is that when we think of time, we're constantly time traveling in our internally guided thinking. We think about what's happened to us, we think about where we are, and we're always thinking about the future, and we're doing so interchangeably and seamlessly. So to prove this to you, think about the possibility of getting a text message where you're going to meet somebody at a cafe. And almost reflexively, what do? Well, you visualize what this cafe might look like. You get a picture in your mind of what it is. And you're not plucking a picture of a cafe off of Google. It's not some random picture. What you're using as raw materials for that image that you're concocting are the snippets of things that you've picked up having visited other cafes. So what this basically says is that we use the past to guide us to what the possible future might be, and we do it constantly in our internally guided thinking. And this is actually pretty adaptive because what it does is to plan and to act strategically. And an example of this is when you have two grandmasters playing chess. So a grandmaster, when he sits down to face off with a competitor, he's not just tracking that game. What he has in his mental space is a record, probably, of every chess game that's ever been played. Okay? So he's living in a deep past that is dictating his presence, or his present, and that is instructing his future. And he is updating what he's doing as he moves from, moving his pawn to perhaps moving his queen. He's constantly updating this. You can imagine if you're working in these constant temporal spirals that you're using a lot of glucose in your brain, and you are. So if you look at a grandmaster playing through several games in a championship, you find that the amount of glucose they're using rivals what the kind of glucose depletion you would see in a marathon runner. So, wow. So we mentalize time, huh? So time is a personal thing that we mentalize. And we do it in a way where we juxtapose our desires and emotion. And it doesn't matter if we're a child that's in a rush to grow up and to put down their teddy bear. Or if we look back to the past, when we think about those memories that make us most happy. And what you find is, time is, indeed, a very personal thing. And this is why you have to be, for instance, wary of politicians that discuss, well, I'm going to take us back to the good old days. Well, why were the good old days so good? Because we don't mean that the good old days were good. What we mean is we can remember times in our past that we were most happy. That's not us wishing the world to go backwards. That's us longing to re-experience that past that gave us the most joy. Something to think about. And I think that the ultimate evidence, I don't know if maybe evidence is too strong of a word, but an illustration of how we kind of interweave our sense of personal time is with our use of language. We use the word future a lot. And the future is most literally defined by events that are going to happen subsequent to a current series of events. That's all. That's what the future means. And what does it really mean? How do we really use it? How do you hear about it on the news? You hear about it from the standpoint of technological progress. Things are going to be better in the future. Computers are going to work better. We're going to have automated systems and so forth. We conflate those two ideas of the future in progress. Why do we do that? Well, it's not because we really think that there's going to be a large amount of technological progress in the future. I mean, there might. We would concede that. But what does it really mean? It means that we hope that for ourselves and our children and our grandchildren, that their future is going to be bright. That's why we conflate those two things. So, in a sense, time is not even really a physical variable in an equation. It's not something literal. Psychologically, how we view time. Time is a story of who we are. Okay? It's that we grew up as a child. We had these experiences with our family. We went to high school. We went to college. We met the love of our lives. And now we're seeing our kids do the same thing. So time, when we reduce it down to the eternal rocks beneath the concept, what it is, time for us is a personal narrative. And you can begin to understand why Saito, down in limbo, now was having a problem getting a sense for even who he was. When his time perception was broken, he can no longer string together that personal narrative. Now we're moving into a phase of the talk that has to do a lot with circadian biology. And this is primarily what I study. Time can break. And what I mean by that time can break is that we can lose a sense for when we should be active versus when we should be sleeping. We lose a sense for what constitutes a day. So how do we track time? I mean, how do we track really long periods of time that would allow us to maintain a personal narrative that stretches almost 100 years? Okay? We do it with the sun. And thank God the sun is out there, because it provides a clock that is objective. We are born into this world with an internal circadian clock that runs close to 24 hours, but not quite. And our clocks actually, on average, run a little bit longer than 24 hours. And so what the sun does is to help reset our clocks so they align with the objective solar day. And you can imagine that if we're unable to do this, what happens is that we would just go to sleep later and later and later on in the evening. And in a few months, we would basically be nocturnal. So it is good that we are able to respond to the sun in a way that would allow us to maintain a semblance for the solar day. So in short, time enters through the eyes. So what I think is most remarkable about how we align our internal clocks with the outside world is that it's done with a part of your brain called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. It's a very small nucleus, really in the basal parts of our brain, comprised of just 20,000 cells. And every single day, these cells are doing intense computing to track the position and the color palette of the sunlight in a way that will allow us to line what's going on in our mind and what's going on in our bodies to the outside world. You know, the problem with this system is that it gets vulnerable as we move on in life. And this is a painting by the surrealist Chad Rankin. I don't think he paints anymore, he does some other things. But it sort of illustrates, I think, this premise. We come into the world with this beautiful, shiny new clock. You know, it works really well. The problem is, it doesn't always. And it particularly doesn't work well in people that are destined to develop some form of dementia, particularly Alzheimer's disease. And there's now a growing literature that basically says that as we get to really, really advanced age, when we start being able to track time, we're vulnerable to dementia. Saito, if you've ever seen Inception, looks a lot like somebody suffering from Alzheimer's disease. And this is something that I have become very interested in. We know that our memory is not quite as good as it used to be when we hit really advanced age. We know that our sense of time starts to break down, but what really is the relationship between the two? There are a lot of things that happen as we get to advanced age. We start developing cardiovascular complications, our immune system doesn't work as well, we can't really regulate our glucose levels so well, and all those things potentially could contribute to our memory problems. So a collaborator and I set out to try to get a sense for, okay, we know all of that, but can we study circadian problems and how they contribute to memory independent of all of that? Can we create public health awareness that circadian problems are some of the things that we most should be concerned about with regards to maintaining mental health as we age? And the existing animal models really didn't work out so well. So we used an animal model called the Siberian hamster. This is a very intriguing creature. It makes its home in the northern latitudes of the Americas and Asia. It's been domesticated to the lab to look at, I think, more prosaic things like seasonal physiology. But what's interesting about these hamsters is that if you give them a simple photic stimulation at the right time of night, their circadian system gets destroyed. And it gets destroyed for life, if you were to track it for the rest of the time the animal's alive. So that means that if you look at its activity record, its moments where it's active versus when it's resting are no longer consolidated. Its body temperature is not regulated in a way so that it rises at a consistent time each day. And if you look at genes in this area of the brain where our internal clocks is, the suprachiasmatic nucleus, they're also not oscillating properly. So this animal, unlike the animal models that came before it, is completely genetically and structurally intact. Okay, so this is pretty cool. So what if we do this light gizmo thing, fry their circadian rhythms? What then would their memory look like? So we went ahead and did this experiment, and before I go on to tell you the results, I want to acknowledge a collaborator of mine who has been really a brother in these efforts. His name is Norman Ruby, and he is a senior scientist at Stanford University. And it's interesting, what we find is that if you look at the normal animals, you do a within subjects experiment where you take the same group of animals. If the animals start entrained, they're perfectly fine, okay? So the left is a graph that's labeled alternation percentage. When animals explore a maze, they alternate what arms of the maze they're going into so they can maximize the territory they're exploring. You can imagine this is adaptive in the wild when finding food or finding a mate. You can see that with the animal, when the animals are entrained to time, they can alternate just fine. Another thing that they can do is they can recognize objects they've seen versus those that they have not. So what a hamster or a mouse will do is to act like a little kid at Toys R Us. It wants to see new toys. It doesn't want to see the old ones. So you can get a sense for memory strength that an animal has by virtue of how much time it would spend with an object it hasn't seen before versus one it already has. And what you can see here is that when they're entrained, they can discriminate novel objects over familiar ones pretty well. What happens if you give them the photic pulse? What happens is their memory is destroyed, along with their circadian rhythms. So they no longer alternate when placed in the maze, and they no longer can discriminate new items. It's an interesting thing, though. If you take a subgroup of them and then dislodge, lesion out their internal brain's clock, so that it doesn't have to try to keep track of the astronomical time of the external environment, something happens. They now can perform just fine. And we're beginning to understand the ramifications of this. What it might mean is that when you think about circadian breakdown leading to something like dementia, we used to think of it in really simple terms. We used to think, okay, well, what's happening is this area of your brain's degenerating, and with that loss of that tissue, you're having corresponding problems with your circadian rhythms and memory. And what this says is that you're not losing something good in your SCN, presumably as we enter really advanced stage. What you're doing is gaining a really bad SCN. It's broken bad. And now it's sending error signals to memory systems that allow us to process information. So this is something that's ongoing in my lab, and we're looking at the ramifications of it. But I think that from a more experimental angle, what it demonstrates is that our ability to keep time is really important for our mental health. And when we stop being able to do that, when we can no longer ride that treadmill, it has repercussions that stretch pretty widely. So that's the entire talk. I just wanted to acknowledge the people that have funded my laboratory, namely the Bio5 Institute and Science Foundation Arizona, who have been very brave enough to provide seed funding for circadian work. So I just also want to give a hat tip to the speaker that's coming next in the Science Cafe series, namely Arvinder Sandhu. So thank you very much for coming, and thank you very much. You've been a really great audience.
We are going to take some questions, and I'll just mention, since he has Arvindo's slide up, that will be April 7th at 6:30. That will be the last of the series, and like I said, we'll let you know what the fall series will be about at that event. We will take some questions, and because it's just one of me, I'm gonna allow Fabian to just pick someone.
My job is to repeat questions.
Yeah, and he'll pick, and then he'll repeat your question so that the whole audience can see, instead of slowing that process down, running with the microphone. So, do we have any questions?
Is there any explanation of why we're not running on exactly the same circadian rhythm as the sun?
That is a very good question, and nobody has given a straight answer to that. We don't know.
Will you repeat the question?
Oh, I'm sorry. You're training me now. Okay, the question was, is there a reason why our internal clocks don't observe solar time precisely? I don't know what the answer to that is, honestly, other than I can start hand waving and saying that the amount of sunlight that's available across the year changes pretty significantly. And even when you're starting to look at things like full rotations of the Earth about its axis, that doesn't exactly take 24 hours either. We average it out. So it's 24 hours plus or minus 15. So perhaps by having some quote unquote plasticity, some flexibility with our circadian clocks, we can anticipate better changes in the solar day. So if the solar day is not staying perfectly fixed, why should our internal, be so fixed?
Fabian, I have a question all the way over here.
Sure.
How does the difference in latitude change as you get further north or south? Affect time.
Yeah, it's what you'd otherwise expect. So we can take an extreme example of this. So we can talk about people staying in, for instance, Arctic base stations. And what you see there is that obviously their circadian rhythms start breaking down. And there are add-on effects to in their cognitive performance. It's actually an issue for oil rig workers working off the coast of Norway, for instance, as well. So the question is, how do we provide a sort of lighting system so that no matter what kind of schedule they're working on, they can stay healthy? It's a question of a lot of research.
What is the status of the pineal gland and melatonin?
Yeah. What is the status of knowledge of the pineal gland? Well, my understanding, and I don't study the pineal gland directly, what I do know is that when light comes in, it is going to regulate melatonin secretion from the pineal gland. So as you can imagine, it's actually going to suppress it. So normally, melatonin exhibits a circadian pattern in terms of its concentration in the body. So it's really low during the day, it's very high in the evening. If we see bright light in the evening, you'll see levels of melatonin actually start to be suppressed. What I can tell you is that the pineal gland is under the control of the suprachiasmatic nucleus, the brain's clock. So in terms of thinking about how the pineal gland might be involved in circadian rhythms, it's a little bit tricky because the causality goes from the SCN to the pineal gland, not necessarily back, but it might go back. It's these are things that people are actively studying.
I have another question over here.
Sure.
How does all this affect a person who is blind or becomes blind?
Great question. So how does this affect somebody that gets blind? Depends on what cells are affected. So normally, the photoreceptors we use to form images, the ones that we're familiar with, they're called rods and cones. And they exhibit proteins that respond to light and change the activity of the cells. Thing is, we have a visual system that's independent of our image-forming one. It's a circadian system, basically. Those cells are not in the part of the retina that's image-forming. They're actually in another part comprised of a different cell type called ganglion cells. So what you might see in some blind individuals is you might see they can't form images, they can't see the external world, they can still synchronize with the external day because those cells are still intact. Now, it's not for every kind of blindness, but can a blind individual, depending on what cells are affected in the retina, can a blind individual sense time of day? Yes, they can, because the two systems are segregated in terms of the cells that control them.
Over in the corner.
Sure.
In the movie, they have a break or a system like the top saying that this is reality. Can you self-hypnotize yourself to dream and come out of it?
Can you self-hypnotize yourself so that you can dream and come out of it? That's a good question, and I have no idea. And, well, and what I can do is, like a good politician, what I can do is I can steer you towards another question that might be of interest. So what happens with somebody who suffers from narcolepsy, right? In the middle of their day, okay, they go to sleep, and sometimes they'll dream. Now, can they string together, when they're in that state, can they string together cohesively the things that happen when they are awake versus when they were sleeping and dreaming? Sometimes not very well, actually. The same thing happens when we suffer from extreme sleep apnea. So that if we're dreaming in the middle of the night and we're having an episode of apnea, sometimes we won't realize if we're sleeping or dreaming. And this actually, I mean, if you look at some of the practical literature here on it, it's funny because, you know, in this confused state that people get in with their tracking of time, with their memory, in something like narcolepsy or sleep apnea, you begin to convince yourself that you like cheated on your wife or something. And of course it didn't happen, or that you killed somebody. I think an interesting example of this was illustrated in Mad Men with Don Draper, where you have an episode where Don honestly believes that he's killed somebody and stuffed them under the bed. And of course, this didn't happen. It's that Don was in a feverish state where his sleep was extraordinarily fragmented and he couldn't keep track of his dreaming versus what was going on in reality. So very tangential, I know.
Got a question over here?
Yeah, on the 2 slides back where you showed the graphs.
Yeah.
This one. What it looks like is if you lesion or ablate the suprachiasmatic nucleus, that the hamsters do pretty well.
Yeah.
Is that that's from memory, past memory, right? That's from things that they were already trained on.
No, well, actually, yeah, technically, sure.
Okay, because I guess my question would be is if it was for learning new things and that part is missing, it's been lesioned out, then wouldn't you expect that they would have a lot of trouble with memory for learning new things if it is true that the SCN is really responsible for...
Sure, I think
you see what I'm saying?
No, I see what you're saying, and I think that that concern is taken out because this is a within groups study. So if we track animals that receive the light and then receive like a sham lesion or a partial lesion, they've also seen the task repeatedly, but they don't recover their memory. So by using a set of controls, it kind of steers you away. It may be true what you're saying. I think that to some degree it steers you away from the conclusion that this performance is not necessarily sporadic and has to do with the fact that the animal saw the test repeatedly. Because animals that have not had their SCN removed but see the test repeatedly, they don't recover their performance. But that could be an issue.
Any other questions?
Children, you said we think in terms of 2 weeks and then a month and then a year.
An extreme generalization, yeah.
I know, I understand.
Yeah.
Is there a certain stage which it sets itself and it stays there?
I never thought about that. I honestly
Would
don't.
you repeat the question?
Let me ask that. So basically, there's a general psychological notion that is probably has a lot of substance to it, that our perception of time, we tend to bin events happening in our lives in larger and larger time frames. And the question was, does this process stop? Like, my goodness, are we still going to be able to remember, you know, May versus June in a particular year, or is everything going to be slopped together? I don't. How about this? I think to some degree it's content specific. So if we have things that are not so personally relevant, we'll probably, you know, allow ourselves to use that heuristic where we'll just bin it in a particular large time frame. But if they're really personally significant, I would imagine that we're still able to be more fine-grained with our differentiation of events than for most other things. So that's what I would say, is that as a rule, I'm not, I mean, I don't know if it necessarily, you know, stops. I think that the brain has a limited capacity to store information. And that's one of the crutches it uses to keep the information in some semblance of order. But that being said, if something is personally relevant, or has produced a lot of, or if it has a strong emotional context associated with it, I would imagine, though I'm not sure if it's directly been studied or not, that we probably have finer grain resolution for when it happened in the past.
Maybe it's a silly question, but if somebody has something like Alzheimer's, now they're losing their memory also, but it's not because of any of these other things. There's actually damage to the brain, and they can prove that, with the autopsy. I'm sure you're familiar. And so, how do you separate these things out? Because as we're getting older, some things just aren't working as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. No.
And Alzheimer's is a good example of that.
Yeah. So I have to put like huge qualifiers for this answer because I'm going to be speculating. I've been speculating a lot. This is real speculation because it's about a topic that I think is very important and is becoming a very big health concern across the world. Alzheimer's disease. Now, what I can say is that we have a sense for the kind of damage that goes on in our brains during Alzheimer's disease. And what you see is the formation of these protein aggregates. We call them amyloid plaques. We also have something called neurofibrillary tangles. It doesn't work the same way in all of us. So if you take an individual with Alzheimer's disease, their brain is going to be full of plaques and tangles. The problem is that if you take another individual that's not suffering from dementia, their brain will also have a lot of plaques and tangles. So is it something that contributes to cognitive health decline as we age? Those particular pieces of histology, probably yes, but it works differently across individuals. I think where you can place something like breakdowns in circadian health, you can break them down as precipitating factors. So think of amyloid and neurofibrillary tangles as being gasoline on the floor, right? You haven't had a fire yet, you're still functioning, you're praying that somebody doesn't light a match. But what probably helps to light a match that starts to link the histopathology to the cognitive performance are things like things we do every day. I mean, how we eat, how we exercise, and how we go about our circadian health and whether that's still active. So what I would say is that breakdowns in time perception and in circadian health, they significantly facilitate the onset and then the progression of Alzheimer's disease. I think that's the best way of couching it. I mean, the reality is, if we all live long enough, we'll probably develop some kind of dementia. We will develop Parkinson's disease for sure. And so it's a question of when. Do we start developing pathology and changes in our behavior before we pass on? And what I think happens when you lose circadian health is that you drag that whole time progression forward. So that maybe if you had better circadian health, your onset of disease maybe would have been a little later.
I was just thinking more of it's got to be difficult for you as you're studying these very people. Is this something that is more normal because of experiences with the time experiences? Or is there possibly something that's in there that has nothing to do with that, but the brain is deteriorating or needs to?
No, I think that's an extremely good point, and it's what any scientist. It's a possibility. Oh, he asked if how germane, how relevant really is the breakdown in the circadian system to the development of something like Alzheimer's, when there might be clearer links to the other changes that are happening in the brain in AD and dementia. And there's no real answer to it. What we can say with relative clarity is that if we take individuals that are in, I think, if I'm remembering the studies, in their 60s and 70s, okay, I think 70s, most of them, maybe 80s. 70s, 80s, let's call it that. If we sit there and we start with a group of folks that don't have any cognitive problems, wait 5 years and ask the question, within that 5-year time frame, which person has started to develop cognitive problems? Which person has started to suffer cognitive problems that would be associated with Alzheimer's disease? What we find is that the people that are most likely to start showing pathology are those whose circadian health started deteriorating 5 and 6 years before.
I've got one more question. Let me pass it.
Some of them with severe sleep disorders when they're younger be more prone for Alzheimer's as they age?
That is an active area of research, and I think that you have a very good intuition, because I think that there's a lot of truth in that, yes. We know in animal models that that's the case. So here is, I think, and this is where I'm being highly biased, this is where you should be very skeptical of drug treatments that purport to treat Alzheimer's disease once the symptoms have appeared. What we're learning is that how we live our lives 30, 40 years before we develop, or we might develop, Alzheimer's disease really impacts disease progression, okay? Sleep is a big one, circadian health is a big one, diet is a big one, how well we regulate our glucose. So I think that here's an important point. There is a tremendous amount of individual variability when it comes to something like dementia, okay? So can somebody live their lives, smoke 3 packs a day, eat a pound of bacon, and lie on the sofa watching Wheel of Fortune and be perfectly fine in their 90s? Yeah, there are some people that probably can do that. They have a tremendous amount of biological resilience. We don't know what's contributing to that resilience, but that is also an active area of study. I think that for the majority of us, are there going to be penalties accrued for not sleeping well for very long periods of time? This is not like, you know, oh my God, you know, I didn't get good sleep in college, or I'm talking about decades. Now, are there penalties that accrue from decades of not sleeping well, or a decade of poor circadian health? Yeah, I think so. And I think they do inform how somebody's going to progress or when they're going to hit onset of AD.
Okay, so I got a little sneaker question, which I'm sure would appeal to the audience, and it's 2-part.
Sure.
So is there something that all of us could do? We hear about brain fitness. Is there something that everybody could benefit from doing? And my last question is, how did you get interested in this field?
Okay. So this is another one of those qualifier questions. This is not an area of study. I don't endorse any products or anything sort of like that. I think what my heartful answer to that would be is that we're studying ways that we can intervene with things like cognitive training. And will there eventually be a regimen that we're going to have confidence in that's going to be able to help people maintain their mental health? And I think that probably will be the case at some point. There's a huge problem, and that is that when you do brain, training games, they tend to be quite similar. And what not all products, but what many products do is they train you to be really good at that particular game, but they don't generalize to other things. So I think that eventually, when we hit on some kind of regimen that is going to allow us to remain cognitively healthy, I think that one of the cornerstones to it is that there's a tremendous amount of diversity of the things that we're doing each day. We're doing something new, we're doing something that interests us, and we're doing something that captures our attention. When you have something that has a long-term plan over years to keep us engaged with new things day in and day out and is able to maintain our attention, then we might have a kind of product that's effective.
And how did you get interested in this field?
I got interested in the field by my good friend, Norman Ruby, who you saw a picture of. At the time, I was working on a mouse model of Down syndrome, and he had this interesting hamster model. And I thought it was the coolest thing that these guys could have a light shined on them at night, and completely lose their circadian rhythms. I've never heard of this. We don't even know how it works. I'm actually thinking of ways of reverse engineering it so that you can do the opposite, right? So can you use light to bring back rhythms so that you can help to solidify and improve memory? So that just fascinated me. And we started on a journey in the mid-2000s to really look at learning and memory in these animals. And at that particular point, we had models that could explain to us the obvious, which is that if you take a mouse or a rat and you give it, you shift its light schedule, like you would see with jet lag, going from Arizona to like France or England or something, yeah, it really screws them up. It's almost a surreal experience getting off the plane sometimes. I mean, you don't even know where you are. You're just being guided to the hotel. So we can do that in the lab, but can we more fundamentally? Can we track how a long-term breakdown in circadian health, how that could lead to memory problems? We don't have models for that. We don't have really, really good ones. And we were trying to use this interesting phenomenon, the Siberian hamster, to tell us about that. So it's captured my my attention ever since. Yeah.
Well, I hope you'll join me in thanking Fabian once again. And just a quick reminder, and I failed to mention the topic is microcosms of time next month, and we've gone from cosmological all the way to the microcosm. And let's bid Fabian adieu so he can get home to his family.